September 1, 1968. The cockpit of Lieutenant Colonel William Jones' A-1 Skyraider fills with smoke 20 miles northwest of Dong Hoi, North Vietnam. His aircraft shudders as anti-aircraft fire tears through the fuselage. In the valley below, an F-4 Phantom pilot waits for rescue, surrounded by enemy guns. Jones banks the propeller-driven warbird lower, scanning the jungle canopy through the smoke. The throaty growl of his Wright R-3350 radial engine, 2,700 horses of raw mechanical power, echoes across the valley like something from another war entirely. Above him, supersonic F-4 Phantoms streak past at twice the speed of sound. Below him, state-of-the-art surface-to-air missiles wait in their launchers. And here sits Jones, piloting a piston-engine Dinosaur that first flew before Japan surrendered. Another explosion rocks the airframe. The instrument panel erupts in flames. The Douglas A-1 Skyraider shouldn't have been there at all. The aircraft made its first flight on March 18, 1945, when World War II still raged across the Pacific. Engineers at Douglas Aircraft designed it as a carrier-based torpedo bomber meant to sink Japanese warships that would never face American forces. Production ended in 1957 with 3,180 aircraft built, all before the first American combat troops landed in Vietnam. By 1968, the jet age had thoroughly arrived. The Air Force operated the State Route 71 Blackbird, capable of Mach 3 speeds at 85,000 feet. F-4 Phantoms dominated the skies with radar-guided missiles. B-52 Stratofortresses carried 30 tons of bombs at 50,000 feet. Against this backdrop of technological supremacy, the Pentagon made a decision that baffled observers: deploy hundreds of propeller-driven Skyraiders to Southeast Asia. The aircraft looked like an anachronism from the start. Built around a massive Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine, the same power plant that pushed B-29 Superfortresses over Japan, the Skyraider featured straight wings when jets flew with swept designs. It carried a 4-blade propeller when missiles were the future. Maximum speed reached just 322 miles per hour, barely half what contemporary jets achieved. The cockpit vibrated so violently on startup that pilots joked about needing dental work after each flight. One Navy aviator recalled his first takeoff with words that capture the experience perfectly: surrounded by noise and vibration, riding something primal and barely controlled. Yet beneath the ungainly exterior lived capabilities no jet could match. Douglas engineers had stripped every unnecessary pound from the airframe during development. Studies showed that each 100-pound weight reduction decreased takeoff distance by 8 feet, extended combat radius by 22 miles, and increased climb rate by 18 feet per minute. The result was an aircraft that could carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance, more than a World War II B-17 Flying Fortress, across 15 external hardpoints. 7 hardpoints lined each wing, one more sat under the fuselage centerline. Pilots could configure the aircraft with any combination of bombs, rockets, napalm canisters, gun pods, torpedoes, or mine dispensers. The payload flexibility proved staggering in an era when most jets carried standardized weapon loads. The Skyraider earned its reputation over Korea from 1950 to 1953. Navy and Marine Corps pilots flew close air support missions, attacking heavily defended bridges and power plants. They knocked out the Wachin Dam with aerial torpedoes when conventional bombs failed. They loitered over battlefields for hours, providing persistent coverage that jets couldn't sustain. The aircraft absorbed punishment from ground fire and kept flying, bringing pilots home with hundreds of bullet holes stitching through wings and fuselage. Korean veterans nicknamed it SPAD after the French World War I fighter, a term of endearment mixed with acknowledgement of its antiquated design. In 3 years of combat, 128 Skyraiders were lost, 101 in combat and 27 to operational accidents, often torque rolls during carrier landings when pilots applied too much throttle. After Korea, the aircraft seemed destined for retirement. Jets increasingly filled carrier decks through the 1950s and early 1960s. The A-4 Skyhawk, a sleek subsonic jet, became the Navy's attack workhorse. The supersonic F-4 Phantom arrived as the ultimate multi-role fighter. The Skyraider lingered in second-line roles, some modified for electronic countermeasures, others relegated to airborne early warning. The Navy transferred its first Skyraiders to South Vietnam in September 1960, replacing even older Grumman F-8F Bearcats. By 1962, the South Vietnamese Air Force operated 22 aircraft. Nobody expected them to matter much in a war increasingly defined by helicopters and supersonic interceptors. Then came August 5, 1964, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Skyraiders from the carriers Constellation and Ticonderoga participated in Operation Pierce Arrow, the first American strikes against North Vietnam. They hit fuel depots near Vinh. Anti-aircraft fire damaged one aircraft from Ticonderoga. A second from Constellation went down, killing Lieutenant Richard Sather. The ancient warbirds had drawn first blood in a conflict that would consume them for the next 8 years. The Navy initially planned to phase them out quickly, replacing Skyraiders with 6 intruders as part of the general transition to jets. Reality intervened with brutal lessons learned over rice paddies and jungle canopy. Vietnam's combat environment proved radically different from Korea's conventional battlefields or the nuclear scenarios dominating Air Force planning. The war sprawled across 3 countries, fought mostly at low altitude against dispersed guerrilla forces. Surface-to-air missiles forced jets to fly low where their speed advantage disappeared. Fast-moving jets struggled to identify camouflaged targets hidden under triple canopy jungle. They burned through fuel reserves in minutes of combat, leaving little time for the prolonged target searches required in guerrilla warfare. Pilots of supersonic aircraft found themselves making single high-speed passes over suspected enemy positions, dropping bombs on coordinates rather than visual targets, then departing for aerial refueling. The mismatch between technology and requirements grew obvious to everyone in the theater. The Skyraider, by contrast, seemed purpose-built for Vietnam's unique demands. The big radial engine could sustain flight at 150 miles per hour, slow enough to spot individual soldiers or gun positions. The aircraft could loiter over target areas for hours rather than minutes, circling until ground controllers confirmed enemy locations. Pilots could dive from altitude, roll in on attack runs at shallow angles, place ordnance precisely on small targets, then pull up for another pass without exhausting fuel reserves. The armored cockpit protected pilots from small arms fire that would cripple jet engines. The massive wings generated lift at speeds that would stall jets, allowing operations from short airstrips cut into jungle clearings. And that thunderous radial engine, derided by jet pilots as hopelessly obsolete, proved nearly indestructible. Unlike turbine engines with thousands of precisely machined parts spinning at extreme speeds, the R-3350's 18 massive cylinders absorbed battle damage and kept running. Skyraiders routinely returned to base with cylinders blown out, oil streaming from punctured lines, and control surfaces shredded by shrapnel. In 1968, the peak year of American involvement, the contradictions reached maximum intensity. The United States had placed men in orbit and was preparing to land on the moon. Yet here, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, survival depended on technology from before atomic weapons existed. The Air Force's 1st Air Commando Squadron received its first Skyraiders in 1964, aircraft modified from old Navy models gathering dust at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Ground crews stripped the gray and white Navy paint schemes, replacing them with jungle camouflage. They fitted the Stanley Yankee extraction system, twin rockets that could blast a pilot free from the cockpit when the propeller made traditional ejection seats impossible. They mounted additional armor plating around the cockpit and engine. The refurbished aircraft bore little resemblance to the pristine carrier birds that once launched from polished flight decks. They looked rough, patched, and well used before ever reaching combat. Major Bernard Fisher arrived in Vietnam with the 1st Commando Squadron and immediately recognized the Skyraiders' potential. Fisher had flown P-51 Mustangs, understood piston engines and propeller-driven warfare. On March 10, 1966, He found himself orbiting a remote Special Forces camp at a Shao Valley, deep in enemy territory near the Laotian border. North Vietnamese forces had overrun the outer perimeter. The airstrip, barely 2,500 feet of pierced steel planking, sat under heavy mortar fire. Major Jump Meyer's Skyraider took ground fire and crash-landed on the strip itself. Fisher watched Myers climb from the wreckage and run for cover as enemy soldiers closed in from the treeline. Every rule said the rescue was impossible. The strip was too short, too damaged, already surrounded. Fisher made the decision instantly. He rolled in through the smoke and enemy fire, wheels down, flaps extended, the big radial engine pulling him through tracer rounds that crisscrossed the valley. The Skyraider touched down on the battered steel planking at minimum approach speed. Fisher kept the engine roaring at high RPM, taxiing through mortar impacts to where Myers waited. Myers scrambled onto the wing, then into the rear compartment, a space barely large enough for emergency equipment, certainly not designed for passengers. Fisher released the brakes and poured throttle to the right R-3350. The overladen aircraft staggered into the air with feet to spare as North Vietnamese soldiers reached the runway edge. That mission earned Fisher the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, it demonstrated what the Skyraider could accomplish in situations where jets were useless. The aircraft found its true calling in combat search and rescue operations. When fast movers went down over hostile territory, Skyraiders became Sandies, the call sign that identified them as rescue escort aircraft. The mission profile capitalized on every advantage the old warbird possessed. Rescue packages typically included 4 Skyraiders escorting 2 HH-3E Jolly Green Giant helicopters. The Skyraiders went in first, locating the downed pilot, identifying enemy positions, and suppressing anti-aircraft fire. They carried white phosphorus rockets to mark targets, high-explosive ordnance to destroy gun positions, and enough fuel to orbit the rescue site for hours while helicopters extracted survivors. Captain J.W. Doc George founded the Sandy concept in late 1965 during an A-1 replacement flight to Udorn. His departure call sign from Bien Hoa happened to be Sandy, and he kept it for operations in Thailand. The name stuck because it captured something essential about the mission: gritty, tough, willing to get down in the dirt. Every Skyraider assigned to search and rescue thereafter carried the Sandy designation. The pilots who flew them developed tactics specifically designed around the aircraft's unique characteristics. They worked in pairs, one marking targets while the other attacked. They made repeated passes over enemy positions, drawing fire to identify hidden gun emplacements before the vulnerable helicopters arrived. They carried smoke generators, cluster bombs, minigun pods, napalm, whatever the specific rescue required. Lieutenant Colonel Dan Wiley flew Sandies from Pleiku and Da Nang in 1968 and 1969 with the 6th Special Operations Squadron. Wiley had cut his teeth flying P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings during World War II, then served as a test pilot at Edwards and Wright-Patterson Air Force bases, helping develop the F-94 Starfire, F-104 Starfighter, F-105 Thunderchief, and F-106 Delta Dart. He knew jets intimately, had pushed them to their limits in test programs. Yet he chose the Skyraider for combat in Vietnam because nothing else could perform the mission. He described flying the A-1 in terms that emphasized capability over elegance. Big motor, big wings, big airframe, the most lethal platform on the ramp when measured by time over target and ordnance delivered. The aircraft's vulnerability proved both legendary and overstated. Between 1964 and 1972, the Air Force lost 191 Skyraiders in Southeast Asia, with 150 lost to combat. The Navy lost 65 aircraft to all causes. Of the combined 256 losses, 5 fell to surface-to-air missiles, 3 to aerial combat, the vast majority to anti-aircraft artillery. The numbers told a complex story. Yes, the Skyraider died when caught in concentrated flak. No aircraft could survive sustained fire from radar-guided 37mm or 57mm guns. But the losses remained remarkably low considering the missions flown. Skyraiders operated at altitudes where every peasant with a rifle could shoot at them. They loitered in known flak traps for hours, deliberately attracting fire. They made repeated low-level passes over the same gun positions. The fact that fewer than 260 aircraft were lost over 8 years of sustained combat operations suggested the old warbird could absorb punishment that would obliterate faster, more sophisticated aircraft. On June 20, 1965, Lieutenant Clinton Johnson and Lieutenant Junior Grade Charles Hartman III of Navy Squadron VA-25 scored the war's first aerial gun kill. Flying Skyraiders loaded for ground attack, they encountered 2 North Vietnamese MiG-17 jet fighters. The MiGs possessed more than double the Skyraiders' maximum speed, carried air-to-air missiles, and were specifically designed for aerial combat. Johnson and Hartman had 4 20mm cannons and bombs meant for ground targets. The MiGs made the mistake of slowing down for gun passes rather than using their speed advantage. Both Navy pilots employed tactics that predated jet warfare: hard turns at slow speeds, using the Skyraider's superior low-speed maneuverability to position for killing shots. Hartman shot down 1 MiG with cannon fire. The victory seemed impossible by every conventional measure, yet it happened because the Skyraider's ancient design provided capabilities the jets had abandoned. The South Vietnamese Air Force operated Skyraiders throughout the war with particular effectiveness. The aircraft served as the NAF's primary close air support platform from 1960 through the early 1970s. By 1968, the South Vietnamese had received 131 additional aircraft beyond the initial 22. Unlike American pilots who rotated home after 12-month tours, Vietnamese Skyraider pilots accumulated thousands of combat hours in the same aircraft. They knew the A-1's characteristics intimately, understood its quirks and limitations, could extract performance that surprised visiting American instructors. Vietnamese pilots developed expertise in low-altitude operations that matched anything American aviators achieved. They flew close support missions in weather that grounded jets, navigated by terrain features when instruments failed, maintained formation discipline through intense anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft's flexibility extended beyond pure combat operations. Skyraiders hauled supplies to isolated outposts, inserted reconnaissance teams behind enemy lines, conducted forward air control missions, sprayed defoliants along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, rescued downed pilots from positions jets couldn't reach. The 6th Special Operations Squadron at Pleiku operated in direct support of the Studies and Observations Group, the Joint Special Operations Unit conducting the war's most sensitive missions. SOG teams infiltrated North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia on reconnaissance, sabotage, and prisoner recovery operations. They operated without conventional support, often beyond the reach of standard rescue assets. The Skyraider provided their only reliable lifeline: aircraft that could reach remote insertion zones, provide sustained fire support, and execute extractions under conditions that made helicopter operations suicidal. By early 1968, approximately 131 additional Skyraiders had reached South Vietnam beyond the initial transfers. The Navy continued attack operations through February, though increasingly sophisticated North Vietnamese air defenses made their missions progressively more hazardous. On February 20, 1968, Navy A-1H Bureau No. 135,300 flew the last attack mission by a Navy Skyraider in the Vietnam War. The aircraft survived the mission and later found its way to the National Naval Aviation Museum. After February, Navy Skyraiders shifted entirely to electronic countermeasures roles, jamming North Vietnamese radar and protecting strike packages from surface-to-air missiles. The EA-1F electronic warfare variants continued operations until December 27, 1968, when VAQ-33 flew the final combat mission from the carrier Intrepid. The morning of September 1, 1968, broke clear and hot over Nakhon Phanom Royal Thai Air Force Base. Lieutenant Colonel William Atkinson Jones III, 46 years old, commander of the 602nd Special Operations Squadron, prepared for a routine rescue escort mission. Jones came from military lineage. His grandfather had served as a U.S. congressman. He graduated West Point with the class of 1945, the same year the Skyraider first flew. His career had taken him through Strategic Air Command, troop carrier operations, tours in the Philippines and Europe. He'd completed 98 combat missions from Thailand before this particular morning. Nothing about the pre-flight briefing suggested the day would be different from dozens that preceded it. 20 miles northwest of Dong Hoi, North Vietnam, near the Ban Karai Pass where the Ho Chi Minh Trail snaked through mountainous jungle, two F-4D Phantoms designated Carter 01 and Carter 02 were conducting a pre-dawn strike. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from camouflaged positions, catching both aircraft. Carter 01's crew ejected and were quickly recovered. Carter 02's aircraft commander ejected successfully, but the jungle canopy swallowed him before rescue forces could mark his position. Radio contact confirmed he survived, was mobile, but surrounded by North Vietnamese troops converging on his location. The survivor needed immediate extraction before the window closed forever. Jones led a flight of 4 A-1H Skyraiders with call sign Sandy, escorting two HH-3E helicopters toward the survivor's last known position. The terrain favored defenders, steep karst formations, thick jungle, multiple concealed gun positions commanding the valley approaches. Jones understood the tactical situation immediately. The helicopters couldn't risk insertion until someone located the exact survivor position and suppressed the anti-aircraft threat. That meant low passes through concentrated fire, the kind of flying that killed pilots no matter how much armor surrounded them. Jones rolled in first, A-1H Bureau number 139738 descending to minimum altitude, the right R-3350 engine pulling him through the valley at 200 miles per hour. Enemy gunners opened fire from multiple positions. Tracers arced across the valley in overlapping patterns designed to create inescapable kill boxes. Jones banked hard, scanning for both the survivor and gun positions. He made another pass, then another, each time drawing heavier fire as North Vietnamese gunners refined their aim. On one low pass, Jones felt an explosion beneath the aircraft. The cockpit instantly filled with acrid smoke as something vital failed. He couldn't see instruments, couldn't see terrain ahead, could barely breathe through the choking fumes. The logical response was immediate egress, jettison the canopy, activate the Yankee extraction system, bail out before the aircraft became unflyable. Jones kept flying. He had established radio contact with the survivor, but hadn't pinpointed the exact location. Without that information, no rescue would be possible. Through the smoke, Jones spotted the survivor on his next pass, a figure on the ground near a rock formation, pinned by fire from a multiple-barrel anti-aircraft gun positioned atop a karst outcropping. The gun commanded the entire valley. Any helicopter attempting rescue would fly directly into its field of fire. Jones couldn't attack the position immediately because doing so risked hitting the survivor with fragmentation from his own ordnance. He needed to maneuver for a different angle, which meant more low passes through the kill zone while enemy gunners tracked his every movement. Jones rolled in again, positioning for a rocket attack on the gun emplacement. ZSU-23-2 fire, twin-barrel 23mm rounds traveling at 3,400 feet per second. Slammed into the Skyraider's center fuselage. One round struck the Yankee extraction system mounted behind Jones' seat. The rocket motor ignited instantly. In the confined cockpit, the extraction rocket became an incendiary device, spraying flames forward around Jones while the motor burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The canopy jettison mechanism failed from battle damage. Jones manually released the canopy using emergency procedures, but that only fed oxygen to the inferno now consuming the center fuselage. Flames engulfed his arms, hands, neck, shoulders, and face. His flight suit ignited. His oxygen mask melted. The survival vest he wore as standard equipment caught fire against his body. Other Sandy pilots watched the drama unfold and screamed over the radio for Jones to bail out. The transmission quality was poor. His radios were failing as wiring burned through, but he could receive on a single channel. He heard his wingmen urging immediate egress, heard the desperation in their voices as they watched flames stream from his cockpit. Jones ignored them all. He had located the survivor. He had identified the gun positions. He needed to relay that information before the rescue could proceed. Without coordinates, the downed pilot would die. Jones forced the burning Skyraider into a climb, pulling away from the valley at an angle that minimized exposure to remaining gun positions. The pain must have been extraordinary. Third-degree burns covered his exposed skin. Every movement sent fresh agony through nerve endings. The smoke made breathing nearly impossible. His vision narrowed from pain and oxygen deprivation. Yet Jones maintained enough control to attempt radio transmission of the survivor's coordinates. His transmitters had failed, melted by fire or destroyed by ground fire. He could receive but not send. He tried repeatedly, got no confirmation, realized the information wasn't getting through. That left only one option: fly the crippled aircraft back to base and deliver the coordinates in person. The distance to Nakhon Phanom measured approximately 60 miles over mountainous terrain and enemy-controlled territory. Jones flew an aircraft that was actively burning, with unknown structural damage from multiple anti-aircraft hits, with control systems that might fail at any moment. Standard procedures called for immediate bailout in such circumstances. The chances of making it back seemed minimal. But bailing out over North Vietnam meant capture, interrogation, probable execution, and more importantly, it meant the survivor's location died with him. Jones made the decision in seconds. He pointed the Skyraider east and nursed it toward Thailand. The flight back defied rational explanation. The Wright R-3350 continued producing power despite fire damage to fuel lines and ignition systems. The wing structure held together despite holes from 23mm rounds that should have caused catastrophic failure. The control surfaces responded to inputs despite hydraulic damage. Jones maintained altitude and heading through sheer will, fighting the pain that threatened unconsciousness, keeping the aircraft level when every instinct screamed to bail out before it exploded. His wingmen stayed with him, calling out altitude and heading changes when his instruments became unreadable through damaged plexiglass and smoke residue. Jones lined up for landing at Nakhon Phanom, lowered the landing gear, they deployed normally, a minor miracle, extended flaps, and brought the burning Skyraider down onto the runway with a landing that witnesses described as textbook perfect given the circumstances. Ground crews raced toward the smoking wreck as Jones shut down the engine. Colonel Leonard Vollet reached the aircraft first and later recorded his shock at the scene inside the cockpit. Everything burned to a crisp, including Jones' helmet, oxygen mask, survival vest. Yet Jones remained conscious, reaching for his maps, refusing to exit the aircraft until he confirmed ground crews understood the survivor's location. They extracted Jones carefully, his flight suit fused to burned skin in places. He weighed nearly 200 pounds with equipment, making the extraction from the narrow cockpit difficult. Medical personnel attempted to begin treatment immediately. Jones waved them off. He insisted on briefing intelligence officers first, providing exact coordinates for the survivor's position and detailed information on enemy gun emplacements. Only after delivering the complete tactical picture did Jones consent to medical treatment. He continued the briefing from the operating table as doctors worked on his burns, ensuring every detail reached the Rescue Coordination Center. The massive rescue effort near Dong Hoi continued through the afternoon, with Jones' coordinates guiding the approach. The information proved accurate. Rescue forces recovered Carter 02's aircraft commander later that day, pulling him to safety because Jones had provided the exact location and suppressed the anti-aircraft threat long enough for helicopter insertion. The price of that rescue showed clearly in photographs taken immediately after Jones landed. The cockpit gutted by fire, metal surfaces blackened and warped, the seat burned through to its frame, the instrument panel melted into unrecognizable shapes. The Air Force nominated Jones for the Medal of Honor. The nomination wound through military bureaucracy, while Jones underwent extensive treatment for his burns at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. He was promoted to full colonel on November 1, 1969. On November 14, President Richard Nixon approved the Medal of Honor for Colonel Jones. The following day, November 15, 1969, Jones was piloting his personal aircraft, a Piper PA-20 Pacer, when it struck power lines near Woodbridge Airport in Virginia. Investigators believed he may have suffered a medical issue during flight. The exact cause was never determined. He was 47 years old, just over a year removed from the mission that earned America's highest military decoration. President Nixon presented the Medal of Honor to Jones' widow Lois during a White House ceremony on August 6, 1970. The entire family attended. Jones' youngest daughter gave Nixon a copy of Maxims for Men-at-Arms, a collection of quotations by the great and the humble, a book Jones had written. The first copy had been delivered to Jones the day before his fatal crash. The ceremony recognized not just one mission but a career defined by service, courage, and an understanding that technology alone never wins wars. Jones' mission represented everything the Skyraider accomplished in Vietnam and everything it cost. The aircraft had performed tasks that jets couldn't attempt. It had absorbed damage that would destroy modern aircraft. It had delivered a pilot home through circumstances that defied mechanical possibility. Yet it had also demonstrated the price of obsolescence. The fire that consumed Jones' cockpit happened because propeller-driven aircraft required extraction systems mounted internally, systems that became death traps when ignited. The low-altitude operations that made the Skyraider effective also exposed it to every anti-aircraft weapon in the North Vietnamese inventory. The slow speed that enabled target identification gave enemy gunners sustained tracking time. The technology that made rescue possible also made it extraordinarily dangerous. Throughout 1968, the contradictions intensified. Navy Skyraiders ended attack missions in February, shifted to electronic warfare until December, then retired from combat operations entirely. The increasing sophistication of North Vietnamese air defenses, radar-guided guns, surface-to-air missiles, improved MiG tactics, made the Skyraider progressively more vulnerable. Air Force Sandys continued search and rescue operations because no replacement existed, but the missions grew more costly. The Studies and Observations Group relied on Skyraider support for their deepest penetrations into Laos and Cambodia, but each insertion carried higher risk as enemy forces learned to predict sandy operating patterns. The aircraft's mechanical reliability, legendary for 2 decades, began showing strain. These were airframes designed in 1943, built in the late 1940s and early 1950s, accumulated tens of thousands of flight hours through Korea and Vietnam. The Wright R-3350 engines, magnificent in their day, required constant maintenance. Spare parts grew scarce as production lines long since closed. Ground crews performed miracles keeping the aircraft operational, fabricating parts that no longer existed in supply channels, cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep flyable ones in service. The Skyraider community developed an expertise in creative maintenance that bordered on engineering artistry. By late 1968, reality demanded acknowledgement. The Air Force began planning transition to newer aircraft. The A-37 Dragonfly, a small jet trainer converted to light attack configuration, started replacing Skyraiders in close air support roles. The A-37 offered jet speed, better survivability in defended airspace, easier maintenance, and lower operational costs. It couldn't match the Skyraider's loiter time or ordnance capacity, but it could survive in environments where the A-1 increasingly couldn't. The Northrop F-5 Freedom Fighter, a lightweight supersonic fighter, took over interceptor duties. Neither aircraft could perform sandy missions with the Skyraider's effectiveness, but the Air Force had no choice. The ancient warbirds were literally wearing out. The transition accelerated through Vietnamization, the process of transferring combat operations to South Vietnamese forces. By 1973, every remaining Skyraider in American inventory had been transferred to the Republic of Vietnam Air Force. The VNAF ultimately operated more than 350 Skyraiders through 6 squadrons. Vietnamese pilots, many with thousands of combat hours in the aircraft, continued flying A-1s until the end, providing close air support through the desperate final battles of 1975. When Saigon fell on April 30, 1975, several Vietnamese pilots escaped by flying their Skyraiders to Thailand. One of those aircraft, Bureau number 139606, the aircraft Dan Wiley flew as Wile E. Coyote survived the war, was recovered from Thailand in 1980, and eventually found its way to the Cavanaugh Flight Museum where it flies today in restored condition. The final statistics told a story more complex than simple win-loss calculations. Of 3,180 Skyraiders built between 1945 and 1957, approximately 600 served in Southeast Asia. The USAF lost 191 aircraft to all causes, 150 in combat. The Navy lost 65 to all causes. Combined American losses totaled 256 aircraft. The VNAF lost additional aircraft in numbers that remain imprecisely documented. Against those losses, Skyraiders flew tens of thousands of combat sorties, delivered hundreds of thousands of tons of ordnance, rescued dozens of downed pilots, supported countless ground operations, and shaped the course of battles across 3 countries. The aircraft shot down 5 MiG-17s in aerial combat, propeller-driven warbirds killing jets through pure pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. Individual pilots accumulated extraordinary records. Bernie Fisher's Medal of Honor rescue at Ashau Valley established the standard for impossible missions. Jones' sacrifice near Dong Hoi demonstrated the price pilots willingly paid. Dozens of other aviators earned distinguished flying crosses, silver stars, and lesser decorations for actions that would have warranted higher recognition in any other context. The sheer volume of heroism became routine, expected, almost invisible because it happened so regularly. Skyraider pilots developed a culture that emphasized competence over glory, results over recognition, completing the mission regardless of personal cost. The aircraft itself became a legend within the community that flew it. Pilots gave their Skyraiders names, personalities, individual characteristics. The proud American honored Jones' sacrifice. Wile E. Coyote commemorated Dan Wiley's multiple tours. Countless other aircraft carried nose art, kill markings, mission tallies painted on fuselages already scarred by combat damage. Each aircraft accumulated its own history, became known for particular quirks or behaviors. Some Skyraiders were considered lucky, returning repeatedly from missions that should have been fatal. Others gained reputations for mechanical reliability or unusual handling characteristics. The relationship between pilot and aircraft grew intimate in ways that jet pilots, strapped into ejection seats and glass cockpits, couldn't quite understand. Ground crews developed equal attachment to the aircraft they maintained. Working under primitive conditions, often at forward airstrips with minimal facilities, they kept the aging warbirds operational through expertise and improvisation. When official parts weren't available, they fabricated replacements. When maintenance manuals didn't cover combat damage, they developed their own procedures. The bond between pilot and crew chief, the enlisted technician responsible for a specific aircraft, became sacred. Pilots trusted their lives to the crew chief's work. Crew chiefs took personal pride in returning aircraft to service, sometimes working through the night to have damaged Skyraiders ready for morning missions. The Skyraider community understood they were flying an aircraft that shouldn't exist in their era. They knew jets represented the future. They accepted their role as guardians of obsolete technology pressed into service because nothing else could do the job. That knowledge created fierce pride mixed with pragmatic awareness. They flew the Skyraider not because it was the best aircraft in the inventory by conventional measures, but because for specific missions in Vietnam's unique environment, nothing else worked. When politicians and military theorists talked about technology winning wars, Skyraider pilots understood the reality differently. Wars were won by matching capabilities to requirements, by using the right tool for the specific job, by accepting that sometimes the best solution came from a previous generation's engineering. The question of why America deployed a World War II Dinosaur to Vietnam in 1968 had multiple answers, all true simultaneously. The aircraft filled capability gaps that jets created. It performed missions that more modern aircraft couldn't attempt. It survived in conditions that should have killed it. It rescued pilots that would otherwise have died or been captured. It supported ground forces when faster aircraft couldn't provide persistent coverage. It operated from primitive strips that couldn't handle jets. It carried ordnance loads that matched or exceeded aircraft twice its size. And perhaps most importantly, it could be maintained in field conditions with limited resources, keeping pilots in combat while jets sat on the ground awaiting parts or specialized maintenance. The deeper answer lay in military procurement cycles, equipment life cycles, and the gap between planned conflicts and actual wars. The Pentagon had prepared for nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union, had built forces optimized for high-intensity conventional warfare in Europe, had developed weapon systems designed for scenarios that never materialized. Vietnam presented challenges that defense planners hadn't anticipated: counterinsurgency operations, low-altitude close air support, prolonged presence over contested territory, operations from austere bases, resilience to small arms fire. None of these requirements had driven procurement decisions in the 1950s and early 1960s. The Skyraider, obsolete by every planning document, suddenly became essential because it possessed capabilities the modern arsenal had abandoned. By the end of 1968, the Skyraider's combat role was diminishing. Jets increasingly performed missions the A-1 had dominated. Vietnamization transferred remaining aircraft to South Vietnamese control. The aircraft that had defined close air support and combat rescue in Southeast Asia faced retirement at last. Yet its influence would persist long after the final A-1 returned to base. The Skyraider's legacy shaped American military aviation in ways that became clear only years later. The lessons learned over Vietnam's jungles directly influenced the development of the A-10 Thunderbolt II, an aircraft specifically designed to resurrect capabilities the jet age had abandoned. The A-10 featured straight wings for low-speed maneuverability, massive payload capacity across 11 hardpoints, armored cockpit protection, and engines positioned to survive battle damage. Its designers studied Skyraider combat reports, interviewed Sandy pilots, analyzed what made the old warbird effective. The A-10 became the spiritual successor to the A-1, built around the same philosophy that sometimes slow, tough, and simple beats fast, fragile and complex. The emphasis on loiter time and ordnance flexibility became central to close air support doctrine. The Air Force abandoned its focus on high-speed interdiction in favor of persistent presence over battlefields. Combat search and rescue tactics developed by Sandy pilots became standard procedures, taught at survival schools and practiced in exercises. The relationship between rescue aircraft and helicopters, refined through hundreds of missions over Southeast Asia, established protocols still used today. Modern rescue operations directly descend from techniques developed by Skyraider pilots orbiting hostile territory, suppressing threats, marking positions, coordinating complex extractions under fire. The aircraft's technological simplicity proved prescient in an era increasingly dominated by complex systems. Modern military forces struggle with maintenance burdens, supply chain challenges, and operational readiness rates that would horrify Skyraider ground crews. The A-1 could be maintained with basic tools, operated from dirt strips, repaired with improvised parts. When computers and sophisticated avionics failed, Skyraider pilots flew on with backup instruments and mechanical controls. That resilience, once considered obsolete, now appears as wisdom lost to pursuit of technological sophistication. Recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq saw similar lessons relearned. Sometimes the simple solution proves more reliable than the elegant one. The aircraft's final combat missions flew in 1975 over South Vietnam as Saigon collapsed. Vietnamese pilots continued flying Skyraiders in desperate attempts to slow the North Vietnamese advance. They attacked columns of tanks, bombed bridges, provided close support for defenders fighting with diminishing resources. Some pilots flew multiple sorties per day, returning to bases that grew smaller as territory fell. When the end came, Several Vietnamese aviators chose to flee rather than surrender their aircraft. They flew across the Gulf of Thailand, landed at Thai airstrips, became refugees. Those surviving Skyraiders represented the final link to an era that began before Vietnam itself became a war. Approximately 80 Skyraiders survive today in museums and private collections worldwide. Several remain airworthy, maintained by enthusiasts who appreciate the engineering and history. The commemorative Air Force operates multiple A-1s at airshows. The throaty rumble of their right are 3350 engines drawing crowds who remember or want to understand. Each flight demonstration captures something of what made the aircraft special: the sheer presence, the mechanical simplicity, the direct connection between pilot and machine unmediated by computers or fly-by-wire systems. Watching a Skyraider perform low passes at airspeed barely above stall reminds observers why the aircraft mattered, why it survived when more modern designs failed. The National Museum of the United States Air Force displays an A-1E that flew 246 combat missions before retirement. The National Naval Aviation Museum preserves the aircraft that flew the Navy's last attack mission in Vietnam. The Cavanaugh Flight Museum flies Dan Wiley's Wile E. Coyote, keeping alive the experience of operating a living warbird. Private collectors maintain others, forming a community dedicated to preserving operational examples. These aircraft serve as flying reminders that military effectiveness derives from matching capabilities to requirements, not from pursuing technology for its own sake. Colonel William Jones received posthumous recognition that extended beyond his Medal of Honor. The Air Force renamed a training facility at Fort Sam Houston the William Jones Readiness Center in his memory. His story became required study at Air Command and Staff College, taught as an example of leadership, courage, and mission focus. The burned Skyraider he flew on September 1, 1968, should have been preserved but was instead scrapped, a decision later regretted when his Medal of Honor citation created historical significance that warranted preservation. Only photographs remain of Bureau number 139738, showing the fire damage, the gutted cockpit, the structural deformation from heat and battle damage. The statistics compiled after American withdrawal painted a comprehensive picture. Between 1964 and 1973, Skyraiders flew approximately 390,000 sorties in Southeast Asia. They delivered over 820,000 tons of ordnance. They rescued 48 downed pilots through Sandy operations, with more recovered through other mission types. They destroyed hundreds of supply trucks, bridges, gun positions, and structures across 3 countries. The aircraft accumulated these results while maintaining lower loss rates than many jet types operating in the same environment. The old warbird had proved itself against every expectation, every prediction of failure, every technological advancement meant to replace it. The broader question, why deploy obsolete technology to modern warfare, carries implications beyond Vietnam. Every generation faces temptation to discard proven capabilities in pursuit of advancement. The Skyraider demonstrated that new doesn't automatically mean better, that requirements drive effectiveness more than sophistication, that sometimes the best tool for a specific job comes from an earlier era. Those lessons applied to aircraft, weapons, tactics, and strategy. They remain relevant in an age of stealth fighters, unmanned drones, and network-centric warfare. Somewhere in the complexity, the fundamental truth persists. Wars are won by matching capabilities to actual requirements, not by deploying the newest technology regardless of mission fit. The Skyraider's story transcends aircraft performance specifications and combat statistics. It reveals how organizations respond when carefully constructed plans encounter messy reality. The Pentagon built forces for one war and fought another. They possessed magnificent jets optimized for nuclear strikes and high-altitude interdiction, then faced guerrilla conflicts requiring low-altitude persistence. Rather than admit systematic failure, they reached into storage, pulled out obsolete aircraft, sent them into combat, and discovered that sometimes old answers solve new problems better than modern solutions. The human dimension matters more than technical specifications. Jones flying a burning aircraft 60 miles rather than bail out. Fisher landing at a Shao under fire to rescue a fellow pilot. Vietnamese aviators accumulating thousands of combat hours in aircraft their American instructors considered antiquated. Ground crews working through tropical nights to repair battle damage with improvised parts. The Skyraider succeeded because skilled, dedicated people made it work despite technological limitations. The machine was remarkable, but the pilots, crews, and maintainers made it legendary. The aircraft's obsolescence proved liberating in unexpected ways. Nobody expected the Skyraider to be perfect. Pilots understood its limitations, accepted its quirks, worked within its constraints. That acceptance created creativity. Sandy tactics evolved through trial and error because no doctrine existed for propeller-driven combat rescue in the jet age. Ground crews developed maintenance procedures unsupported by official manuals. Pilots discovered capabilities the designers never intended. The aircraft became whatever its operators needed it to be, unconstrained by the weight of being cutting edge. Today's military faces similar questions about technology, procurement, and capability. Billion-dollar fighters sit on the ground awaiting parts while conflicts demand simpler solutions. Complex weapon systems require extensive support networks while adversaries operate effectively with basic equipment. The gap between procurement planning and operational reality persists, widened by longer development cycles and more sophisticated systems. The Skyraider's lessons: match capability to requirement, value reliability over sophistication, trust operator innovation, maintain what you deploy, seem almost quaint in an era of fifth-generation fighters and autonomous weapons. Yet those lessons remain valid precisely because they emerged from combat rather than planning documents. The aircraft that shouldn't have mattered, that every trend suggested was obsolete, that represented technology from a previous war, proved essential when assumptions met reality. It flew when jets couldn't, carried loads that surprised engineers, absorbed punishment that should have been fatal, rescued pilots that would otherwise have died, and influenced the next generation of close air support aircraft. The propeller-driven Dinosaur deployed to Vietnam in 1968 accomplished all this not through superior technology, but through matching specific capabilities to actual requirements in ways that more advanced aircraft couldn't achieve. On quiet mornings at air shows, when a restored Skyraider thunders down the runway and climbs into clear sky, the sound carries echoes of missions flown, pilots saved, and battles fought by an aircraft that refused to become obsolete. The Wright R-3350 engine's distinctive growl, unchanged from 1945, reminds listeners that sometimes the best answer comes from knowing what already works rather than chasing what might work better, and that true innovation lies not in abandoning proven capabilities but in recognizing when old solutions perfectly fit new problems.